Welcome everybody to today's session. Um, Carbon accounting training for SMEs. Thanks for the nice introduction, Jaya. Um, I'll change the agenda slightly and I'll put that up in a minute. What I'm actually going to do is just have one session for questions in the middle after about 45 minutes or so. We'll see how we go with the timing. We may finish a little bit early today. We may not, but we've got an exercise at the end. As Jaya pointed out, we'll have the chat running. So if you want to put any questions into the chat, then I'll hold them for that session in the middle to talk about those. Please feel free to ask any questions, and during that session we can have an open session to back and forward around that. I'm happy for that session to run a little bit longer if that makes sense, because at the end I've got an exercise for people to do, and if you end up doing that at home and we talk about that next week, then that's fine with me as well. I just want to start off by saying, sorry, so because I missed. So what's the go to Jay? So Jay, as I think, so we've probably done the introduction to country. So we want to look at climate resilience and why we need to act and why we need to act, what it means. And why this is important is that there's a lot of chatter and a lot of misconception and a lot of quite heated debate sometimes about whether we should do something, whether we shouldn't do something. I want to lay down the background as to why, because of science, because of economics, and because of what's happening in the financial sector, the question of whether we need to do something and when is no longer a question. And so I want to lay the background for the drivers, and then we'll talk a bit about how we respond to that. So as I said, there'll be a question time at about 10:15. Sorry, 11:15, that should be. And then we'll go into a second session after that, and we'll do a little exercise at the end of that. So I want to talk about accounting in this whole series. That's what it's called. And it's not the same old accounting you guys are used to, in the sense that it is financial accounting in the end. And this is the big change that's happened. Very recently, there have been some major changes because this has become important to the financial sector. And the financial sector has linked climate change as a whole and carbon emissions to financial accounting. And you'll see in a minute as we go through this that there are now mandatory laws in Australia which require companies of a certain size to actually report the financial impact in their financial statements every year of climate change and carbon reduction, as well as physical risk. So what are we going to do today? I'm going to set the scene, understand what the drivers for all this are, and look at risks and opportunities. Because when you guys are in small business, a lot of this might not seem that relevant to you, but in the end, everybody in the new scheme of things has risk, but don't focus on the risk. Look at the opportunities as well. So the message I want to take away today is that there's a whole new change, a major change, which has happened very fast. It's a global change. We are impacted by it. And so consequently, there are risks, but also look for the opportunities. All right, so I'll talk a little bit about decarbonology before we start off. So our expertise is in carbon management and nature-based carbon removal projects with innovation and research. That's our main focus. So we look at reducing your carbon footprint, and that's what we're talking about today. How to count your carbon, how to reduce it. We also have our own carbon offset projects. But today we're really here to talk about what this means for you. So why do we need to act, and what does that mean? This is what the newspapers were saying in 2024. Global temperatures have broken records 3 times in a week. The UN said that we're in the era of global warming, global boiling. The climate change is out of control. after the hottest week on record. And in 2024, we actually broke the heat temperature record for the last 100,000 years. Think about what that means. This is the hottest time based on conventional measurements plus archaeological and other measurements in the last 100,000 years. So there is something clearly happening with the climate, which is not normal. And we understand the reasons for it. We've done the modeling for it. The modeling is quite clear as to what's causing it. So the point I want to make here is that what we're talking about here is not people's opinion, but we're talking about science. And whether we like it or not, the planet works on science. And so this is what we've seen in the last little while. So if you look at WA, for example, these are some of the other articles that are more specific to WA, where we saw impact on the natural ecosystem, the eucalyptus forest, very dry and very hot during that last summer. So there's no doubt that we are in a new, seeing the effects of genuine climate change in terms of the temperature of the climate changing. So what does that mean? There was a major shift because this was all seen, the major reports done, the peer-reviewed reports were showing that there is a major change. In 2016, there was what was called the Paris Agreement. And at the Paris Agreement, which was COP26, and subsequently at COP26, which was a couple of years ago, based on the scientific consensus of what the climate was going to do, there was agreement made globally amongst all of the global countries that we would try to keep the climate change impact well below 2 degrees and seek to keep it to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So they're the important numbers to keep in your mind, particularly 2 degrees, but the initial target for this was to be 1.5 degrees. But so based on that science, when that came out, there was a major realization by the financial sector, driven by the insurers, but then by the banks and the shareholding companies, that this wasn't just about science and it wasn't just about feeling good. This would have major financial implications for everybody. And so the big wake-up call at COP26 was within the financial sector, and that's what's caused now a cosmic shift. So now this is where we shifted from carbon counting to carbon accounting. So this little thermometer here shows you that what the pre-industrial average temperature was, what the two targets were from the Paris Agreement, but what it is actually at the top of that is where we are likely still at the moment. So the current projections are that with everything that we're doing at the moment, we will actually reach a temperature rise of 3 degrees unless we act very quickly. And so a lot of changes globally and nationally and in the financial sector have led to action around that. So that's why it's important to us. It's not just about the big end of town. And this is probably the one slide which sums it all up. And this is the important slide which led to all of this. So what this shows you is what we need to do in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the red line to stay below 1.5 degrees and in the blue line to stay below 2 degrees, and when we have to do it. So if you look at the red line, the science, this is the scientific modeling, and the science tells us that we had to actually stop our emissions from rising by 2020 and start to come down. Has that happened? Have we actually peaked in our emissions globally and started to come down in 2020? The answer to that is no, we have not. We still are rising globally. We're still rising globally in terms of our emissions. But even if we had reached that period, we would have until 2000, by 2030, we would have to reduce our emissions by about 50% in order to meet a target of staying below 1.5 degrees. And then by 2050, we'd have to have zero emissions. That means we can't emit anything globally. But even by that point, at 2050, we're not out of the woods. In order to stay below 1.5 degrees, and this is something people don't realize, we would have to actually suck carbon out of the air. So even to stop emitting by 2050, and this is where the so-called net zero emissions comes from, that's not enough. After that, if we don't suck a significant amount of carbon out of the air, which you've already put in there by that point, we will still exceed the global temperatures either 1.5 or 2 degrees, depending on how we're going. That little number on the right-hand side of this graph, that's an important number. Have a think about, does anybody in the chat want to tell me what that number is? Want to have a guess at that number? Jaya knows because she's seen it a couple of times, and it keeps going down, Jaya. That is the number of weeks, folks, that we have until 2030 to stop emitting, stop our emissions rising, and to start to come down, and to get, in fact, reduced by either 50% if we want to get to 1.5 degrees and stay below that, or go above 50, or by 2038 if we want to stay below 2 degrees. It's not very long. And this is the point that became clear at COP26, that in order to get that target, we would have to have major changes in legislation and our approach and what we did. So what does this mean in real practical terms? I call it the can-can. This new global imperative meant that to get to net zero by 2050 means it's urgent. So in what is now the next 4.5 years, we would have to reduce majorly, as you saw on the graph, and then in more than that in the next 20 years after that. So that means we can't kick the can down the road. We can't actually put off acting anymore. We can't hope for some miracle pill to come or some miracle technology to fix this. That's not likely, and we have to act now. The other thing which became clear about this is a global problem. And even if one place acts, or one country acts, or one sector acts, or one person acts, that will not be enough. So we have to have these reductions across all countries, all aspects of society, and all economic sectors, all at the same time. So this means that we can't kick the can over the fence either. And everyone needs to reduce and not just shift their emissions. So I can't simply shift my factory to another country or sell it to another company and not actually deal with my own emissions. Everybody's got to deal with their emissions. And so that means that the focus at that point also shifted from individual country or individual sectors or individual businesses to whole of global society action. So what it means is we've shifted from individual company actions to a need for the whole of value chain action. So value chain is from when things are first extracted from the ground till they get to the final customer. So we just can't kick the can anymore. So as a result of that, there's been a number of major changes. So first of all is that the shareholders who hold shares in the big companies, anything that's ASX listed or listed on the European or the UK or the US stock exchange, have become increasingly concerned that the climate change risks are not being adequately assessed by companies, that they're not being properly managed by the companies they're invested in, and more importantly, what they're doing is not being disclosed to them, the shareholders, because in the end, if the company is impacted by climate change, either physically or by needing to reduce its emissions, then obviously it will lose its value and their superannuation and their income goes. So stakeholders, global stakeholders in the big investment companies and others have become quite active and vocal at pressuring companies to address their decarbonisation and their climate change concerns. And so I've just given you an example of something that happened fairly recently here in Australia in 2022. Those of you who might have heard of Mike Cannon-Brookes, he's a billionaire. He was one of the two owners of Atlassian. He's still one of the owners. He's now the major CEO. He's the CEO of Atlassian, and he's a software guy, but he actually used his ability to buy shares and as a shareholder in AGL, which is the single largest electricity producer and single largest power emitter in Australia, to change their strategy from a coal-based strategy to a renewables-based strategy. So here's an example of an increasing number of powerful shareholders who are forcing big companies and medium companies, but large, particularly big ones, to understand their risks and the impacts of climate change and changing legislation to reduce emissions and getting them to act. So the most effective shareholder activism today is being driven by those major institutional shareholders and financiers. So debt, which is the banks, and this is then also being driven now by the banks, and equity, which is the shareholders. So the other thing to understand is that all of the major banks have actually been shock tested for climate change risk, and they now have policies in place to make sure that they assess a business when they invest in it or lend to it, so that they don't lose the value, that company doesn't lose value, and therefore obviously the loan's not worth as much as it was. The other thing that's happened is globally, and particularly in Australia, the regulators, so the Australian Securities and Investment Commission, for example, who are the ones who actually govern companies, and they're the ones who are responsible for keeping directors and boards honest and behaving well. They're requiring those directors and those boards, as part of their fiduciary responsibility, to be transparent about this. So this is what they had to say a little while ago, and I'll show you a bit later on that things have even moved on again within this to become less voluntary and more mandatory. But they basically, it's that in 2020 until 2023 and mid 2024, they were saying that while disclosure is critical, it is but one aspect of prudent corporate governance in connection with the mitigation of legal risks around climate change. Directors should be able to demonstrate they have met their legal obligations in considering, managing, and disclosing all material risks that may affect the companies. And we know that. So that's what directors' jobs are, and that's what ASIC's job is, to enforce that. But then they said this includes any risks arising from climate change, be they physical or transitional risks. So transitional is needing laws and legislation and drivers to reduce your emissions. So one is the physical impact, and we saw some of the examples of that in my first set of newspaper articles, and also the transitional risks, and that ASIC would continue to focus on that. But then there was a big change. In October 2024, the federal government passed a law under the ASIC Act. In other words, it was the responsibility of ASIC that in a changing timeline, all ASX listed companies, those who are controlled by ASIC, and that's why it's in the ASIC Act, would have to mandatorily prepare climate related reporting reports every year as part of their financial and their annual reports. All right, so they need to prepare annual sustainability reports containing mandatory climate related financial disclosures following the when this passed through. And you can see a timeline on the right as to the size of different companies that will be triggered in this. So from 2024-25, any company with more than 500 employees, consolidated assets greater than 1 billion, and consolidate two of these three, or consolidated revenue above 500 million, will have to do this mandatory reporting. And what I mean by this is you have to turn your carbon emissions and where you sit relative to your competitors, as well as any physical risk and climate change, into profit and loss, assets and liabilities, and report that as along with all of your normal ones. And the first reporting year for those people is actually the 25-26 year. So they have to do their first draft reports this year. After that, those with greater than 250 employees, assets of 500 million or revenue above 200 million, and assets under management above 5 billion, they also have to start reporting from 26-27. And from 27-28 onwards, those with 100 employees, assets above 2.5 million or revenue above 50 million, will also have to start to report. So you guys are SMEs. Some of you may or may not trigger that third level. And so carbon counting, and then accounting for what the financial impact of that risk and opportunity is on your company, and I'll come back to risk and opportunity a bit later when I talk about this in more detail, has actually become, because it's part of your financial statement, as rigidly regulated and requires the same kind of assurance as your tax. So carbon has become accounting. We've moved from carbon counting to carbon accounting. And what's more, it's of the same level as your tax. And you can't get around it. If you don't report, it's like not reporting your other financial parts or not submitting your tax. And if you mislead people, then it's equivalent to misleading them around, misleading the stock market, or misleading your and any other financial aspect. If you think about this carefully, this is a significant change. So the government's not telling you how much you have to reduce. They're not giving you targets. All they're simply doing is making you disclose to your key shareholders and stakeholders, banks, financiers, customers even, what the impact of the need to reduce emissions is, and also any physical impacts that are coming from the climate change, which we already know is existing. So that's a major, major change. So there are state and national targets as well, obviously. So national government's climate change bill passed in 2022 outlines Australia's greenhouse emissions reduction targets of 43% globally. This is now legislated. And so it's a legislated target that the government has to meet. If not, it's essentially broken the law and not met that target. And that can't be changed without being overturned fully by Parliament. So there's a lot of initiatives from the federal government. West Australia has an interim target of 80% below 2020 levels by 2030 from all their government agencies across the state. And those agencies have been in the process of preparing strategies for reducing by that amount. Local governments at the moment are excluded from that, but the state government encourages similar levels of ambition across government, businesses, the private sector, and the community. There is some discussion now that in fact the federal government is actually looking to set by 2035 an emissions reduction level of 75%. All right, in this round of Parliament. particularly because they want to actually host the next one of the COP meetings that's coming up, conference and party meetings coming up. Then they're looking to even set that target any higher. So you can see that this has come from international down to national and to local. And so the outcome of this is that, and there was a great carbon wars over this at national level about introducing a so-called carbon tax. What it means is, and this is where it starts to become important to SMEs, and I'll come back also to why it's important to you as well, is that in its how the nation energy objectives shape our decisions, the Australian Energy Market Commission, which is the one who sets the rules, and they're the ones who determine how much utilities can charge you for electricity, for example. They released quietly a report which basically said that when they consider how much utilities can charge you for your electricity, they will now start to consider the fact that it costs these electricity companies to meet these national, international expectations, and therefore they will allow them to increase their charge to you, small business and local governments and others, a value of $70 per tonne of CO2. In other words, to enable them for every tonne of CO2 that they reduce, they can pass on $70 of cost to you, the customer, which will increase your bill by that much because we've got to put transmission lines in, we've got to put renewables in, we've got to buy batteries, we've got to do all sorts of things. And that's okay at the moment, but what you can see that by 2050, that amount that they will add to your electricity bill is $420 per tonne. So for the first time, we actually have a carbon price in Australia, which is visible. It was always there, but now it's visible. And all of those who use electricity, which is you guys, SMEs and councils and other people, this will pass through to you. So you need to be aware now that there is a carbon price, and that's why you need to start accounting for this in your own business, because this price, while you see it here in electricity, will in fact be on every part of your input. Because if people have to spend money to reduce their emissions, then they will pass that on to you. Okay. So one of the questions you need to start to think about is, does your organization include an emissions price in decision making? The other thing that I also want to mention, which I talked about in kicking the can down the road, and I'll just go back up to that one for a little bit, back up to this one, is that because this is a global responsibility, the Europeans have introduced this legislation called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And as part of that, what that means is that anybody who imports products across the European border has to pay a carbon tax on the embodied carbon, which is all of the carbon from cradle to wharf, that's in that product, if it's higher than the European benchmark. So say I'm introduced, there are 6 key commodities that are in the first round, and one of those, for example, is iron. If I'm importing steel, if I'm importing steel into Europe, I turn up at the wharf with my ton of steel. I have to have a report, an independently verified report against international standards, which says how much embodied carbon, how much carbon's in there from all of the processes that have led me to have that steel at the wharf. And I need to show that to a very officious looking carbon taxation official. They will then compare that against to what a ton of steel has in terms of embodied carbon in Europe. And the bad news about that is that they've actually been doing this for a while. So if there's a difference between my carbon, the amount of carbon that's embodied in my steel and the European steel, let's say, for example, that mine is 120 tons per ton of steel, and theirs is only 60 tons per ton of steel, then for that difference, that 60 tons of difference, I have to buy European credits for each one of those. So I'd have to buy 60 European credits for that ton of steel. And at the moment, those credits are running at about 120 euro. So 60 times 120, you can do the maths on that, right? So for every ton of steel that I take into Europe, I'm going to have to pay a bit over $6,000, right? Nobody wants to do that. So what are they going to do? If I'm the importer into Europe, apart from not going into Europe, and the sad news I have for you folks is Europe's not the only one that's doing that. The Japanese are doing it, California's doing it, various other people are doing it. Then what I will do is I will look back down my supply chain, my whole value chain, if you like, and I will start to put pressure on all of my providers to get them to reduce their emissions, because their numbers are the ones that end up in my number. I can't, and if they won't work with me to reduce their numbers, I will find lower producers. But to do that, they have to actually count their numbers. So what this will do, and it's already starting to do this, and I've seen, and Cameron and I and others at Decarbonology have already seen letters from bigger companies to their suppliers, which say, have you counted your carbon emissions? Do you have a plan to get them down? And are you willing to work with us to change your activities or change your product so that we can reduce ours? So this move by Europe, which basically will affect the whole world, and you can't hide. If you produce it in China, then your number ends up in the European number. If you produce it in Australia, your number ends up in the European number. So you can't just shift your factories offshore. Then that they will move away from you as a provider if you're not reducing fast enough for them, or else they will pay you less for your product or your service if you haven't changed, because they don't want to pay that money when they cross the border. So this will take a couple of years to settle through, but basically what it means is now that there's a carbon price in the world that people must count those. So anybody who provides anything to anybody who imports into Europe in particular, but there's an increasing number of others like Japan, Australia's considering one as well to protect our own industry when we decarbonize, will have to count their carbon, have to have a decarbonisation strategy. So if you're thinking here, okay, I wasn't triggered by any of those numbers or I'm not yet, you're not safe. Because if you provide to somebody who is triggered by those numbers, they will need you to give them their numbers because they've got to report those numbers. And if they see you as a risk, then that will appear in their risk register, and they will have to respond accordingly, either give you less money or remove you from their whole supply chain. And this is the big change that happened 2 years ago in Europe, which is now making its way through the global economy. So that's what that legislation, which we now have at the end down here, is actually talking about. And that's why it's important to SMEs that you understand what carbon accounting is. So not just counting your carbon, but actually putting a price on it, so that at some stage, if the people you supply to come knocking or you trigger the legislation in your own right, then you can actually provide that number and you can understand the impact on you. And you can just see from this that even in terms of electricity, you need to start to forecast forward how your electricity might rise. And at some point, you might decide that actually you want an electricity source which is not dependent on the grid and these utilities who can charge you all this money. And so you'll choose, for example, to put your own photovoltaics on your own renewable energy system, because that then fixes the price. And you can't be continually gouged or charged this price as it goes up. All right. So summing all of this up, this is one of my favorite cartoons and my favorite graphics. Whether we like it or not, people can say, I don't need to do this, I'm not going to pay attention to it. Even if the mandatory requirement for reporting was to become voluntary again, it's irrelevant because the global financial sector and debt and equity and governments all know they have to do something. And the science is quite clear. It's universally accepted. Planet works on science and laws of physics, whatever our philosophical or political view is. So we can choose not to do this. And those who are on this call can choose not to do this. As a country, we can choose not to do this. There's a whole nation, of course, at national level, which we know very well, who's chosen not to do this at the moment, called the US. But it doesn't change the reality of having to act. And it doesn't change the consequences of not acting, because the later you act, the more it costs you. And that's what we saw from that forecast of the electricity. So the problem will still be there later. So as the cartoon says, there's two pieces of bad news for the ostrich. One is that you put your head in the sand, but the lion's still there and he's going to eat him anyway. So the problem is not going to go away. The second one is that the longer you leave it, the more you're in the poo and the harder it is to respond to it. So it'll still be there later. You're deeper in the poo, and the later you act, the more costly it's going to be to act. And it's not just electricity that's passing through to you, it's cost of water, because water needs electricity. You've got to do other emissions reductions. So the good news is that there are frameworks and guidelines that enable us to act pragmatically and carefully without bankrupting ourselves or the economy in the process. And that's what we'll look at in the rest of this series of workshops, in particular the second one. So that's the background for why it's important that SMEs understand carbon accounting and that they know how to do it. And then subsequently, we'll talk about in the sessions how they can actually reduce those emissions. And I want to reiterate that there seems like a lot of risk here, but there's also opportunity, because obviously if you can move faster than your competitors and provide your customers with a carbon reduced product, then you'll either get a premium on that product or you'll pick up you'll become part of their supply chain. But it's also just good business sense, because you can forecast through 3, 4, 5 years and account for the increasing costs that are going to come through because we need to respond to this. There was a lot to take in there. Are there any questions about that?
Is there
I have a
anyone?
question. I've got
Joe.
one.
Hello.
Hello. I guess my question is that if you were considering importing, for example, from China, which is, something that I haven't done, but I do probably need to do it going forward eventually.
Yeah.
When do you think this will start hitting, as far as, that we'll actually start seeing these increases, this pricing included in the cost of these products?
I think the carbon border adjustment mechanism in Europe only came into legislation in 2024, and companies are only required to do this seriously in 2026. My feeling is that it'll be the next probably 3 or 4 years before, certainly at SME level, that you start to feel the impact on products. But as I showed you from that announcement, that report from the electricity regulator, those electricity carbon costs are passing through to you as of this year. So they've set the prices for 25. That price is going to come through. They'll set the price for 26, and that price will come through. And that will, by default, flow through to any product that uses electricity. So you will start to see these numbers, these increased costs increasingly going forward. In answer to your question about China, it's actually not, I'm probably not going to give you the answer that you expect. But yes, the Chinese carbon numbers will actually start to appear, I expect, in products within 2 or 3 years. But you need to keep in mind that they're the fastest decarbonising economy on the planet. And so they saw this coming. And so, in fact, they will actually be probably as low as Australia or lower in terms of carbon emissions, particularly from electricity, but across their whole sector. within 4 or 5 years anyway,
Yeah,
because they
and I
saw this
guess,
coming. And that's the message, I guess.
yeah, and I think what you've made me really think about is how important it is to support local economy to keep all these prices down for consumers.
It is, that's true, but not at the expense of just subsidising. What we have to do is support these companies and the local industries to actually decarbonise so they don't
Yeah,
have that cost to pass on. That's what's really important,
absolutely. Yeah, thank
and
you,
not just
Chris.
subsidise them. But I guess what I'm saying, that whether we like it or not, this is not a government policy in a sense. It's a global thing that's happening, and we can't change it. We just have to respond
Yeah,
because we're in that global supply chain.
and it's great to hear that this is all happening now, that that we're talking about it. It's a relief to hear it.
It is, but it will take a couple of years to come through. The question is whether that's soon enough to meet that timeline by 2030. My intuitive feeling is not. Well, I think we've already actually exceeded 1.5. We've put in place enough carbon to exceed it, not by the end of the century, but within the next 2 decades. So that's the other thing I was at this stage. There's once we hit that milestone, there'll be another COP meeting, and everybody will say even more so, oh dear, we're in deep trouble. And this will kick up yet another level. So any other questions? That was a good question, Joe. But so yeah, and that's why we need to start to put in place support for SMEs and others, the whole economy, not just to subsidize them, but to help them to reduce faster in their emissions. And if you look at it carefully, people like iron ore, the big iron ore producers, they've been on this track for a long time, and they're decarbonising heavily very fast. So is the rest of the mineral sector, because they're heavily exposed directly to this internationally. But if you're a supplier to them, and we'll look about this in a bit more detail when we go to the next part of the session, if you're a supplier to them, that number counts as well. So the suppliers to the big end of town are also starting to receive the letters to say they have to do this accounting, this carbon counting and accounting, and they have to have their own emissions reduction strategies. And the other thing which is interesting is that, are they willing to change their product or their service so that it helps the company itself reduce its own emissions, not just your emissions, but their emissions as well. And this is where the opportunity lies for people who can produce products which reduce their customers' emissions. Not just reduce their own emissions in making the product, but you produce products that help your customers reduce their emissions. And that's where there's a real opportunity. And so I like to say, in fact, don't dwell on the risk. Here's a great opportunity. And it's not much time. Quicker the change, greater the opportunity. Any other questions?
Chris,
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you. So, would you be like in future, not like 2030, even before that, will the small businesses be considering on alternative raw materials which has less carbon price embedded in it, or will they be developing new products, or would you see a market changing in that part globally based on this carbon price in every area, like not just in the building, but all over altogether?
I think there are several parts to your question, Joe. It's a good question. The first one, as I said at the beginning, is that it's every sector. Nobody's exempted from this, because sectors only exist to supply somebody, either a service or a product. And so consequently, everybody in every sector, everywhere in the world, has to respond to this and will be required to do. Part of the question you talked about was embodied carbon rather than direct emissions, and I'll talk about that more in the next session, the difference between those and how you count them. But the point about this again is that number that goes across the European border is both direct emissions, but also emissions embodied in materials and products, because in the end, that all sums up. So companies, the big focus has been at the moment on people's direct emissions, so their electricity emissions or their fuel emissions or whatever. But increasingly, you will see also a focus on how much carbon's embodied in the product itself as it's been made. And so if you can make those products cheaper, because that number ends up there, then you get an advantage in terms of having less embodied carbon in there. And so you should focus on that as well. And I'll talk about that in a minute, because I'm actually going to show you this legislation, the standard that people are required to report against in the second half of this, before I send you everybody off to think in a bit more detail about some of these questions. And what that clearly says is that you have to include what's called scope 3, which is all of your supply chain, which means all carbon that goes into making something that you use or that you produce will be there. So you need to start to count those as well. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Listen, waiting for the next part of the yeah.
So there's one question there. If we are not importing steel for inclusion in construction, e.g. Rio bar, but we do import some products made of steel, such as augers for drill rigs, would it also apply to those? Yes, the answer is that this will ricochet down the whole supply chain, and everything will be affected. So even if you're not importing the steel, someone's using that steel to make products. And companies aren't going to just make low carbon and high carbon steel. They're not going to have two factories and they'll sell this one because it goes to augers and this one because it goes to something else. It will end up in everything. And that's the thing that people don't understand. So your water, your electricity, all of your products, your fuels, ultimately, and I also want to add, by the way, that this cost is not something new. It's not some kind of monster that was hiding under the bed and has suddenly jumped out. It's just been growing under there anyway, because people have been decarbonising, Chinese and various others. And so that cost has been sitting there anyway. It's just the major change is that because the financial sector's worried deeply about this and they need to understand it, is that people are being forced to show it. It's not a new tax or anything that's just appeared out of nowhere. It's simply making transparent what was happening and the fact that it's going to happen much quicker and in the next 5 years or so, and then even beyond that. Any more questions? There'll be another session at the end. It's a major change very fast. But you can see why we needed that. Okay, in that case, let me then go on.
Thanks, Chris.
So as I said, what we're talking about here is show us the money. And if you want to understand how things work, then it comes down to this. So governments can make reporting mandatory or not. They can make targets mandatory or not. In the end, this is actually now driven by the people who control the money and give that money out to you, which is shareholders and banks. And so they're actually driving this requirement for climate-related disclosures in the financial statements. And so as of September last year, there is now a mandatory requirement that companies report the climate-related financial information, but this is part of a set about sustainability in general. So for those of you who are sustainability people, also be aware that there is a mandatory standard now which is requiring which companies can use to report the impacts of other sustainability related things on your financial health. That one's just not been made mandatory around the world yet. But increasingly, the one to disclose climate related information, because that's where the financial sector is already hurting, is becoming pretty much universally mandatory. So I just noticed, for example, that Spain had introduced that requirement recently, but it's also increasingly across the world. And even if it's not mandatory, because the banks are global and the people who lend you money are global and your shareholders are global. And if they're not, they will be in the companies that you service because you're small, you're the shareholders in your company. But if you supply to those companies, then they need to do this. So they brought out a new standard. Obviously, if you're going to get people to report, you ought to report using the same language, using the same approach. It's just the same as financial reporting. So the way to think about this is that this is a new requirement to add to your existing financial reporting. But what's more, it will be assured and it will be verified and checked by the accountants and signed off by the board, and at the same level as any other financial information in your financial statement. And because you declared it to the public, you can't budget, and it has to be right. So it will increase the amount of work for the bigger companies. And if you're not triggered yet, but you could be, depending on how small your S is, if you're an ME, for example, you will probably trigger within 2 years from now, and you'll have to do this. Then it's useful if you are likely to trigger or you expect to be called on by one of the big ones who has triggered, to start to understand how to do this and put in place your accounting measures in advance. So we have this thing in Australia, these two, there's an international standard and then there's an Australian standard which reflects that. The legislation requires Australian companies to report against that Australian standard. So here it is. This is ASICS, and this is the Australian Accounting Standards Board. And you'll notice that this is not the Australian Sustainability Standards Board. This shows you it's serious accounting. So we've moved from carbon counting to carbon accounting. So this is the standard. I've given you the link to the overview. You can knock your socks off and get the full standard if you want. As an SME, you may not need to follow it in detail, but you should at least understand it because it has implications for what could be asked of you. And you may, if you're an ME, at least trigger it later on. So as I said, there are 2 Australian reporting standards under the sustainability framework. And those are actually in place for climate-related reporting. It's part of the ASIC Act. They changed the ASIC Act and the Financial Market Infrastructure and Other Measures Acts to make this mandatory that you report. Relevant entities have to disclose their climate-related plans, their financial risks and opportunities in according with the standard, the AASBS2, and the big ones who've triggered will start this coming year. It's understood that because they're so far behind and people aren't used to doing this, there'll be about 2 years of grace. So those who start to report this year will have 2 years to get their act together. After that, then the same scrutiny and the same frowns and ultimately penalties for getting it wrong will apply. So again, just like your tax, you can't not hand in your tax, or you can't not disclose something or disclose something incorrectly. The same thing will apply then to your carbon and climate change related risk. And it'll have to go through full assurance at the level you need to. So there's actually 2 of them. There's the links to them. The one that is important at the moment, because the sustainability related one's not mandatory yet, but watch this space, that could come as well. But the climate related disclosures one is. There's a link to it if you really want to, feeling insomniac sometime after today or tomorrow, read the full disclosures standard. But here's a summary of it. And there's important bits for SMEs to keep in mind as well for yourself, so that you understand what will be required of you by the big end, because you see how they think. So they use 4 pillars. These frameworks use 4 pillars. Governance. And those companies who trigger this have to show their governance processes, their controls and procedures to monitor, manage and oversee the sustainability or climate-related related risks and opportunities. And the point about this is not just risks, you also have to identify where you've got opportunities. So your risks on your register become liabilities and your opportunities become assets. Those assets can be tangible assets. For example, if you have carbon credits, which you've bought or you've created, then they become a tangible a tangible asset. But you might also have an intangible asset in that by changing your product, you're more likely to be bought by companies and therefore your value goes up. So your carbon-free product relative to your competitors becomes an asset. And there's a whole new bunch of changes to accountants. They have to get their mind around this as well. Then you've got risk management. So what is your strategy to understand the risk and then respond? How are you going to manage that risk? What are you going to change? Are you going to change your suppliers? Are you going to change your product? Are you going to buy offsets? Are you not going to do anything? And what metrics and targets? And the point about this is that they can't just be wishy-washy. You have to have clear messages about this and put timelines on them, targets, metrics, when, and the governance part means you have to track those metrics. So these companies who disclose these things, if they say as part of their management plan that we will reduce our scope 1 and 2 emissions, and we'll talk about what they are in the next session in more detail, that we will reduce those by 25% in the next 2 years, then in 2 years, they have to explain why they didn't do that and what that impact is on their share price and in their financial reporting. So the related risks arise out of the interactions between the entity and its stakeholders, society, the economy, and the natural environment, and through the whole value chain. And this is where it can impact a number of SMEs as well, because you'll be in those supply chains. So I guess I'm trying to show you this to show that this is as serious now as any other financial reporting and has the same government requirements. You have to go through assurance, which means that you need to be able to measure the carbon that you emit now very accurately, because you then multiply that by some kind of cost if you have to pay it directly because you can't reduce it, or you have to actually cost your reduction measures, how much it's going to cost you to reduce to get in line with where you need to be, and put numbers on that. And that's not just your direct emissions, your electricity, which is what's called scope 2, or your direct car exhaust emissions, or your direct gas oven, gas stove emissions, or whatever it is that you emit directly. But now all of those in your supply chain. And that's why you can see why a risk-based approach affects the supply chain now, because if I have a big emitter in my supply chain, that's a risk for me because they will pass on that price to me. Or if their carbon is embedded in something I import into Europe, one of these other countries, then I will pay for that. And so that's why companies are required under this, not to talk about it more in a minute, to not just look at their own emissions, but the whole supply chain or value chain. All right. So it's not just your current financial impacts, but the nature of this is that you need to be forecast out into the future. So we know that the global emissions reduction has to be a certain amount, and we know that there are certain science-based pathways, and I'll talk about those in a minute, which companies should reduce on. So you don't have to just report the impact this current year, but because you must have a strategy to respond to this over a number of years, both the actual physical impact because your insurance goes up, or because you could lose an asset, or you might have to change it, get more water or whatever, but also the impact on your decarbonisation strategy. So you must have a strategy, and that will go into the future. So suddenly, just more so than normal financial forecasting, because of the long terms of this, the climate related and the carbon related forecasting and reporting is long term as well. So it's not just the current ones, but what you expect to happen going forward. So you identify your climate related risks and opportunities, how they've affected your financial position currently, your financial performance. So in other words, your financial position, which is your financial statements, assets and liabilities, your financial performance, how you've gone this year, how has the carbon risk, this whole thing, physical and transition risk, affect your financial performance and the level of cash flow. Have I had to spend more money because I've got on electricity? Is that going to increase going forward? Have I had to spend money on some kind of reduction process? Have I had to buy a renewable energy system to go on the roof or whatever for that reporting period? And then you have to also forecast that out to future periods. And it can be an asset impairment for managing this. Here's an example which has already happened. Some of you may not know this, but one of the main power stations in Collie, coal-fired power stations, is the Blue Waters, privately owned Blue Waters power station. The Japanese owners of that power station wrote that off in 1990. Right? They already saw the writing on the wall, and they basically, as an asset, wrote that entire $2 billion of that asset down because they knew that it wasn't worth anything going forward as a coal asset. Okay, so it will not just affect your cash flow, but it affects your assets as well. And you can get advantage of that, of course. So if they, of course, had a big wind farm, then it would have meant that that was an asset that went up in value because people wanted that. You could identify investment in new technologies in your financial position related to your strategy, and that created a relative opportunity. So it's liabilities or risks and opportunities. But you also need to explain the anticipated effects of those risks and opportunities on your financial position going forward. In the short term, that is the next 5 years or the next 2 to 3 years. The medium term, which is really through until 2030, 2040, and then the long term, which is 2050 onwards. You could disclose the effects of a transition to a lower carbon economy, such as increased revenue from products and services, or costs associated with this. And so this standard sets out those criteria for when quantitative and qualitative information is required, when disclosing only qualitative information is permitted, and when you can do it quantitatively. In other words, you have to do the real numbers. So at the core of this is your emissions, because this is all driven by how much you emit. So you are required to disclose your absolute greenhouse gas emissions. And by that, it means your embodied and your actual emissions, expressed as metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So you must actually disclose not just the cost, but you must disclose your actual annual inventory, your direct one, scope 1 and 2, but also is required to do your scope 3, which is your supply chain emissions, because that's the basis of how you then do your accounting, because you need to put numbers on that. They must be measured in accordance with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol corporate standard. So this gives you an indication of which particular standard. We'll talk about that in the next session next week, how you actually count and do accounting. But there's a global standard called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and all international companies have to use that. You must provide scope 1, 2, and scope 3 emissions. I'll talk about those in a bit more detail next week, but scope 1, as I said, are your direct emissions, so exhaust from cars, gas from your stove, those kinds of things that are within your fence or your boundary, your factory, which you emit directly in your activity. Scope 2 is electricity. So if you use electricity that comes from Collie, the emissions from the power station in Collie, you have to count those. And then the scope 3 emissions are all of your upstream, all of your upstream emissions. In fact, and we'll talk about this next week as well, you need to actually do calculations on your downstream, in other words, your customers. What your product, the use of your product by your customer means. Think about why that's important, right? Because remember, we're all embedded in a supply chain or a value chain, and then people at the top of that wear the cost. So it's important that I know how much effect or how much emissions my product or my service has on my customer. Anybody drop in the chat or speak up and say why that's important? Well, it's important I know just not my own emissions, but what the emissions are from my product or service. Obviously, because my customer's concerned about it, if my emissions are higher than my competitor, then they're going to buy my competitor's product and not me. So I need to understand not just the emissions that are given off by me, but if they use my product and it gives a lot of emissions or causes them a lot of emissions, they'll buy a product that doesn't do that so much. There are 15 categories of scope 3. It's quite complicated. This is the bit that's still a work in progress. At this stage, the expectation is that companies would account for 65% of their supply chain emissions first up by 2030, and then the remaining 35% they would need to fix up after that. So you can breathe a sigh of relief if you're not one of the 65% of suppliers. You'll get a reprieve until 2030, and then they'll start to talk to you after that. Entities with activities in asset management, commercial banking, insurance. This is the sting in the tail of this. They're required to disclose some information about their financial emissions. In other words, the emissions of the things they've invested in. Right? Because that's a risk. If those things they've invested in have high emissions and are a risk, then that's a risk for them because they'll go to business or they'll get less money or whatever. So this is, again, as we're saying, what drives this is not just you as an SME, but it's your bank. They have to actually account for all of the emissions and risks in their portfolio. Same with shareholders. And that's a major change, but it's a major driver as well. And so again, you might be required by your bank to make this information available at some point. By the way, the other side of this, which I haven't talked about because we're doing a carbon accounting, is insurance is going to go up, whether we like it or not. All right, because more climate change impact, more the insurers pay, the more your insurance is going to go up. So you need to factor that in going forward. And you may not have noticed it, but there was an article in the newspaper about 2 years ago, which said that overnight the insurance premiums in Broome had quadrupled because of the increased storm and rain damage up that part of the world. The one that could affect people down here is bushfire. Right? Bushfires are going to increase under climate change. If you're at risk of bushfire in your factory or even in your house, then your insurance is going to go up as well. So you need to factor those things in as well. All right. As well as your industry, what it says, you have to do your transition risks. In other words, your change in carbon and the fact that we have to reduce. There's your physical risks, your climate-related opportunities, not just your risks. So the amount and percentage of asset or business activities which are aligned with climate-related opportunities, and so therefore give you opportunities, they become assets on your register. The amount of capital expenditure that you're making. So if not you guys, but the people who you are supplying to, it's important to understand that. So they have to say how much capital they're expending to respond to climate change and to this changing carbon world. Their financing, how much they're borrowing to do that, where that's coming from, the investment deployed towards climate-related risks and opportunities. So it's not just the actual cash flows, it's also about their capital expenditure, because you need to invest capital to reduce your emissions. The other thing and this is the interesting one to keep in mind, is that they're required to run an internal carbon price. So they must show in there in your report that they have one. And when they're audited by the auditors for their financial report, they have to show what internal carbon price they've used. In other words, what am I actually predicting that 1 ton of carbon in my activities will cost me? you may be surprised to know this, but the big end of town, oil and gas, mining, and various others have been running shadow carbon prices since the mid-80s because they saw this coming. So they'd already built this into their considerations. But now anybody who's reporting under this must have an internal carbon price. So what I'm saying, which I showed you from the electricity, is that these internal carbon prices will increasingly become transparent. And so we'll actually see a full carbon price in the economy. Even if there's not one in the economy, you have to do it in your own accounting process. And remuneration of executives and management has to be linked to climate-related considerations. So yeah, there has to be proper governance, and people can lose or gain money as executives of this. In the end, though, because it's under the ASIC Act, if a board fails to do this and they have a failure related to this, then the board itself can be fined or deregistered. Members of that can be deregistered if it's significant enough. All right, so there's no getting away from this for those who are triggered. And again, because you're SMEs, be aware that they will need to look at you and account for that if you're important. I'll just move on quickly now to talk about some of the other terms that exist in this space, which will set us up for a little bit later on. Because it's important to understand these when we're talking about this whole space of accounting and how we respond in particular. So you've probably heard the term carbon neutral. There's a new term, a new kid in town now. Carbon neutral is becoming the old, out of date term. There's this new one called net zero emissions. And people get confused between that. Right. So because you in the early 20s and until quite recently, how you would show that you were a good citizen and taking care of your emissions was that you would declare carbon neutrality. You would aim for and get to carbon neutral. That's actually changing now. You need to be aware of this as well as a small business, because you might be trying to attract your customers or attract your clients by showing them that you've got independently certified emissions reduction strategy and that you are doing the right thing. So one of the big changes recently is that there's this new thing called the net zero standard has come out, which is to find this new way of counting carbon and how fast you must reduce and what your reductions would look like, which is called net zero. So carbon neutral has a minimum requirement that you cover your scope 1 and 2. In other words, your own emissions. You're encouraged to do your supply chain ones, but you're not required to under carbon neutral. Under net zero, you must cover all of your scope 1 and 2 and scope 3 emissions. So you can't claim to be carbon neutral just on, or sorry, can't claim to be net zero just on your scope 1 and 2 or your direct emissions. You must also can only declare that you're net zero if you have actually removed, reduced or offset all of the emissions from your supply chain as well. All right. And so those companies who are setting targets to be net zero by a certain time have to be very clear which bit it is. And if you're going to do this as an SME to attract some of the big fish, you need to be clear in terms of your definition of this. And we'll talk a bit more about that in session 3 when we talk about the strategy. Your level of ambition, there's no requirement for a company to reduce its emissions under the carbon neutral. You don't have to reduce your emissions by a certain amount. You can just offset. So you can just buy offsets which neutralize your emissions rather than actually reduce them. And quite recently, there's been a big problem with the Australian Climate Active certification. A number of big companies have actually withdrawn from that because of that, because it didn't necessarily drive people to reduce. They just carried on business as usual. They just bought carbon offsets, which we'll talk about a bit later, to make them look as though they were carbon neutral. And because of that, a lot of companies are pulling out of it, and they're going to have to reassess So those of you who have gone carbon neutral, be aware that your carbon neutral badge is starting to be looking a bit tarnished because of that. Whereas to be net zero, you must be reducing your emissions along one of the scientific pathways that says that you must reduce first and then offset, and not just for your own emissions, but your supply chain emissions as well. So that's why the new term net zero comes out. But you don't have to be zero at that point. Okay, you can claim to be on a net zero pathway without actually having zero emissions, either direct emissions or offset emissions. So it's why it's important to understand the difference. And I'll talk about these a bit more in the third session. So if you want to claim to be net zero by 2050, which is where we have to get to, and we're a long way behind, so it's going to get more expensive and more work quickly, that means that you can't emit more than 10%. So you can't offset more than 10% of your emissions by 2050, you and your supply chain. If you claim to be net zero earlier than that, then you have to reach that point earlier than that. So what that means, for example, is that in the modeling that have been done by the International Energy Agency, they're saying that the energy sector, electricity sector, has to be net zero by 2035. All right, if we're to meet that target. So that means that all electricity globally needs to be emitting no more than 10% of its current emissions. How many years to that, folks? 10 years. So in 10 years, the entire electricity sector is expected to be emitting no more than 10% of its current amount. That's not Australia, that's globally. That's what that means. To achieve carbon neutrality, you must purchase carbon offsets that result not in carbon, under carbon neutral, you can purchase offsets, but they can be where other people have reduced their emissions. In other words, they've stopped emitting, they reduce less, and therefore you can pay them and take their reductions as yours. If you think about it, by 2050, we can't have any emissions. So there'll be no emissions reduction offsets. The only ones that will count, because we've got to start to suck carbon out of the air, are sequestration or sink ones. Think about that now. So they're the ones that are going to be most valuable. So if you can actually have a process that removes carbon from the air rather than just reduces your emissions, then they're much more valuable. But if you want to claim carbon neutrality, you can use either the reductions ones or the sink ones. If you want net zero, to say I'm net zero by 2030, and you use offsets for that, they have to be the removals ones. So the rules have changed quite a bit. And in fact, even in Europe, the European definition of carbon neutral, in fact, now is that you must use sink offsets as well, ones that physically remove carbon forever from the air. Well, I'm just kind of putting this out there. We'll look at that in more detail because it can be a bit of a confusing area going forward. So the last question, then we'll go to some questions again. If everyone is accounting for the scope 3 emissions, then doesn't that effectively lead to double counting, which in turn overstates the actual emissions? Excellent question, Xavier. Everybody asks that. That's why when you report them, you actually report them as scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. All right. So when you show them as scope 3, that says to people that these are the ones from my supply chain, and those are my supply chain scope 1s. Does that make sense? So you're not double counting because you're identifying them. You're just identifying the whole embodied carbon in your product or your service. And you're saying, these are my direct ones, scopes 1 and 2, and these are the ones which come from my supply chain. And the supply chain people would then declare their scope 1 and 2s as scope 1 and 2s, but you'd show them as scope 3s. That way you're not double counting. Does that make sense? So that's how under net zero, you can actually, what's that one? Who can, okay. So you're not double counting because you're just showing clearly which bits belong to which and saying, these are the bits that I emit directly. I can control those directly. These are my supply chain ones. And they're all showing the number. And then your suppliers to you will show their direct emissions as scope 1, and all their suppliers will be scope 3. So you can follow the chain all the way back down, but it's not double counted. Does that make sense? Because you're declaring the scope 3s as being ones that are from your supply chain, they're not your direct ones. And people can see whether you're dealing with your direct ones, and they can see also which ones you're trying to deal with in your supply chain. Does that answer that question, Xavier? Yeah, you'll need to reflect on it. Basically, it's not double counting because you're showing that they're not your direct ones, that they're from your supply chain. But in the end, what matters now is the total number of emissions that are in your thing, whether it's from your supply chain or from you. And so that just shows people that these are my ones and I should be able to manage those directly, and I need to. These are the ones from my supply chain. Yep. So that's the view, because it's shifted to looking at you. So have a think about it. But basically you'll see, because you've declared them as being scope 3, people know that they're actually, so you don't double count them. They're from your suppliers. And but in the end, it's all the scope 1s, all scope 2s, and all scope 3s that carry the cost. Each one of those tons of CO2, whether your supplier emitted it or you emitted, has the cost. It just helps people to understand which ones are not directly in your responsibility, but are your supply chain, and which ones are yours. So in your number, it's not double counted. But have a think about that. In fact, it'll probably make more sense when I do the accounting part when we go forward. So the important thing is to understand that there are now scientific pathways for different sectors. So if you're trying to think, okay, if I want to say that I'm on a net zero pathway and I want to reduce by a certain amount, what should my emissions be at a certain point in time if I belong to a particular sector? So there's now a standard which defines what you can and can't say about this, and how fast you should reduce and not actually reduce. So it says that we have to have rapid deep emissions. So these rapid deep cuts to the value chain emissions are the most effective, and the only way to really reach stay below 1.5. This is the central focus. So they want you to reduce first, then offset, which is a big shift in people's mindset. Most companies will require deep decarbonisation of 90 to 95% to reach net zero, but that's not expected to happen for every sector at the same time. Globally, that's the case, but some sectors are slow, some sectors are fast. So as I mentioned, electricity need is expected to be at that point by 2035, but aeroplanes are not going to be there by then. They're going to be some of the last cabs off the rank. All right, so this is the thing, to understand where your SME is, in which sector, and realistically how fast you can decarbonize directly, but also look at your supply chain and see how fast they can decarbonize. The main thing is that there are now a set of clear pathways that people can do their modeling, which they can turn into numbers, which then go into their accounts. You're required to set near-term and long-term targets. So that's why you'll see a lot of people now saying, I'm going to be net zero in scope 1 and 2 by 2030, or I'm going to be net zero by 2040 or 2050. By 2050, you have to be net zero in scope 1, 2, and 3. You don't claim to be net zero until you actually meet those targets. So you can declare I'm on a net zero pathway, but you can't claim to be net zero till you reach that point. But what people want to see is you're on the net zero pathway or better. So it's all shifted from we're carbon neutral to not that we're net zero, but that we're on a pathway to net zero. Or if you claim you're going to be net zero scope 1 and 2 by 2034 or 2035, you must reach 90% reductions in the scopes you're talking about. You're required to have long-term targets that are 1995 by 2050. There's also the ability to go beyond the value chain. So in other words, you can actually show that you're not only the net zero across your whole supply chain, but that you've actually removed carbon from the air to offset your historical emissions as well. Because remember, by 2050, there's no more emissions. Someone's going to have to suck carbon out of the air, or we miss the target. So there's a new term called beyond the value chain, which means that we are actually removing more carbon from the air than we've actually put in there. All right. So I'm going to open a question session again for about 15 minutes, but just for the next, where are we now? For the next 10 minutes, maybe, these are some of the questions that you as an SME should think about. You can't think about them all now because your brain's pretty full. A lot of stuff swirling around in there. The lecture notes will actually be available I'll put them in the chat before we go, so don't just jump off because I need to find them, put them in there. But you should go away and think about these things now. So these are the key questions for you to see how relevant this is, how it affects you. Over a quiet drink or a hot chocolate or whatever, when you're calmer at the end of the day, or some other time when you've got time to think about it. So have a quick think about some of these though now, and that might trigger some more questions that you might have. But these are the key questions to take away for you to think about for your business from today. So what if any of the current mandatory regulations or drivers will require your business to decarbonize? Does this mean anything to you? Is it actually going to affect you? Do you need to decarbonize? Do you need to count your carbon? Not. If you don't think so, then that's fine. But if ultimately you'll find yourself that at some point you will have to. But what are my risks of not decarbonizing at an acceptable rate? What if I just do nothing? What if I sit here, do business as usual for the next 5, 10 years? Does that really affect me? Who are the key stakeholders that drive these targets though? Who's actually expecting you to do this? Is it the government? Is it Grandma because she's the chair of the board? Is it your customers? Is it the banks? And if you're a listed company, is it your shareholders? Because in the end, the people who matter, is it your customers? In the end, they're the ones that matter, and they're the ones who make you think about this decision and change. Don't get ahead of them. Don't be behind them. All right? Be where they want you to be. But the companies who are triggered by the legislation have to work through this to show that they're not at risk because they're behind, or they're not going too fast and incurring a liability they don't need to. And if you identified who your key stakeholders are, customers or whoever they are, do you think that given the cost and the challenges of responding, that they're willing to pay for that? Because in the end, we're SMEs, we want to stay in business. All right. If they're not willing to pay for it, should we do it? Can we do it? And that'll depend on which stakeholder they are. If I'm the sole supplier to a big company that says you shall do it, then clearly I should do it. But will they pay for that? Or do they expect me to pay for it? And they just shift to somebody who's willing to pay for it. So these are real questions you have to ask yourself. Is the client and the stakeholder willing to pay for it or not? The question for us as citizens and as the community is that we will all pay. Sorry, folks. There's no getting around this. We either pay now in the transition or we pay when the climate smacks us later. So be prepared that prices will go up. It has to. Because that's the science and that's the economics of it. And the longer we take to respond, the more it's going to cost us. Because the climate lion has not moved away. If your business has already set and announced your targets for 2030, some of you said we're going carbon neutral, some say we're going net zero. Have you sufficiently detailed your strategy and your budget to achieve this? Have you thought about it? Have you just declared this and you haven't thought through the cost? Because if you can't do it, you'll have to retract later. And what does that look like? What would be pragmatic? What would be a pragmatic and achievable target for you? If you were to say, we're going to be science-based net zero. What is that target? Have you thought about that? Do you need to? Because that's the new language. Should I be carbon neutral or should I be net zero? Which one should I put out there to show that I'm a good citizen, or that to attract customers? We'll talk about this more a bit later on, but you need to start to think about that. And even if it's not mandatory, so even if there's no, you're not triggered by the legislation, what are the other motivations and benefits for doing greenhouse gas accounting and decarbonising your business anyway? Right? So this kind of sums all this up. So these are some of the things that I want you to go away and think about for the next week or so before we come back to look at how we actually count this horrible thing called carbon emissions, scopes 1, 2, and 3, and how we turn that into dollars next time. Any questions now based on that? A lot of questions for you. Your chance to reflect some of those to me. And Jay is quite right. This is your chance to get hold of someone who knows this space very well and can provide you advice. Otherwise, you have to come and see us with your hand in your wallet. So
I have, Chris, I just wanted to ask if for a retailer business, small business, how and where will they be? Because that's a major proportion of the small SMEs where we have like few employees. It may not be mandatory for them to declare, but how do they report it? Will there be a change in the tax forms that they submit at the end of the year, or where will be, how?
No, the tax forms are just profit and loss. So that's the actual, so in a sense, it just gets picked up in their expenses. Where it is reported is in financial statements. So if you're a company that actually issues that, has your accountant prepare financial statements, which is profit and loss and assets and liabilities, then it will show up in there. And so that's the requirement under the legislation that those companies who are triggered by the legislation have to report that in their financial statements. If you're a small retailer, then, as I said, it depends on your stakeholders, depends how small you are. But in a sense, it's important to do that because it helps you to understand where your risk lies. The whole point I'm making about this is that you don't do it because it's mandatory. You do it because to see if there's any risks for you. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So even if you don't do it formally, even if you do it informally, it helps you to understand where you're going to get increased costs, for example, in your day-to-day operations, whether you're selling products that people might not want. Right? I happen to sell a particular product which comes from a certain country, which is fossil fuel based and it's not very efficient. Right? My customers don't want that sort of product anymore because they can't emit so much. So therefore, I'm going to be stuck with an inventory full of these things, which people want less often or they won't pay as much for. So that's where it comes back to retail. So again, this is where you're not looking so much at your emissions, but in fact, how you can help your customer reduce their emissions, because that's what they're interested in.
So will
Does that make sense?
retailer?
Does that answer that question?
Yes. And the other thing is, will a customer or a business will be looking to hire a facility or a commercial facility which has a solar panel installed or will there be any change in that kind of a thing so that there will be a scope 2 reduction?
Well, yes, it depends how material that is in terms of whether that's the big one. If they're someone like a retailer, a lot of their emissions, their direct emissions come from electricity. And so the answer is yes, because of course that electricity price is going to be passed on. So the people if you're the people who own that building, then you're going to get less customers because they will want to reduce emissions and what's more, reduce the price. So by putting photovoltaics onto the building, either if you're going to lease that building out, or if it's your own building, you are buffering yourself against those rises. I take the price now. There's a life cycle cost of that energy that's fixed going forward. I'm not subject to the rises that are passed on from the utilities, but also I've got emissions-free electricity. Allegedly, we'll talk about that particular bit if you put solar on later, because even though you put solar on, you may not be net zero emissions depending on what you do with your offsets. But yes, so the answer is that if you're a building owner, that you need to consider that. And so if you look in the scope 3 ones, which we'll do next week, there's a whole thing around if you're a lessor or a lessee.
Yeah.
And it comes back to this whole question is, will people still want my product? Whether that's a building that, which is leaky, uses a lot of energy, has no solar panels because I've got to buy more electricity or gas or whatever. That's my product. Is that what people are going to want or not?
Yeah.
Does that make sense? So it's a good question, and that's the answer. So it services as well. Also, services as well. So it does. The other thing that's coming through, of course, is embodied carbon, because in the end, the building materials that make up that building or make up my factory or whatever, the price of carbon will pass through on those, because at some point someone's emitting scope 1s and 2s, and they have to pay that price at that point. They'll pass that into my product. And so when I build a new building, all of those accumulated embodied carbons in the materials will pass on to me at that point.
Yep. So even if it is a small business or just hiring a small facility, there are areas that they can or they should look into to reduce their emission, isn't it? It's not for the big, it's not for the employee.
It's all the big ones, but there's benefit to you to do it, as I'm saying, even as a small business, because there are some costs which are coming through to you already.
Yeah.
Particularly around electricity. The difficulty you might have, of course, is if you're leasing from somebody else and they won't put renewables on, what do you do? If the landlord controls that, what do you do? What would you do, JR, if your landlord, you needed to reduce your costs and they wouldn't put PV on?
Yeah, we have to go to look for another
You'd look
facility.
for somebody else facility that does that, and there's a benefit and opportunity for those facility owners.
Yeah. So these people will be compelled to put this extra.
Yes, they will ultimately. And again, if you're the bank that lent the money to the person who built that facility or that bought it, and they see that your customers aren't going to go there, are they going to be happy? No, because you might not be able to pay your mortgage ultimately, and they lose their money. So you'll see increasing pressure on you from the banks as well. Yeah.
There's a question from Kylie about the
Sorry,
chat
Kylie.
session.
Is there any clarity on when to expect that climate reporting may become mandatory for local government? That's an excellent question, Kylie. The answer is that we can expect. I'll flip that question in reverse. In the end, what have I said is the main reason why you need to do this analysis and report? It's because of the risk. All right, because it actually points out where you're at risk. So you can expect that at some point it will be made mandatory by the government, the state government, that local government, because they control who does or doesn't. We'll have to do it because it's a risk. My feeling on that is that probably I expect it will kick in no later than 2030. Right? If you want to know my reasoning for that, it's because all hell's going to break loose in 2030 because we're not reducing enough. The financial sector's getting even more nervous, and everybody's going to go, oh my goodness, and everything's going to become regulated even more, because that'll be our oh my goodness moment. And so I expect that state governments, local governments will be made mandatory, as the state government will be itself, by 2030. In the meantime, you should do it anyway because of the risk. both physical risk and financial risk. And so for those of you who are advising or can access your senior executive and your councils, you need to put this to them in terms of risk now. We actually need to do this counting and start to deal with this now because it's a risk, not because it's mandatory. Does that make sense? And that's your question. Don't quote me. Don't say, Chris, bump me in the street and say 2030. Instead, you said it would be mandatory for local governments by 2030. But I hope you're getting the feeling that because we're going to miss those targets and the climate's getting nastier, that will be one of those benchmark moments. And everything will kick into another level of overdrive. And so you can expect, if it's not before then, that it will become mandatory for local governments and state governments by 2030. But you should do it anyway, in the meantime. Same as all you guys should do it, just to quick back of the envelope calculation to see whether your insurance is going to go up, whether your electricity bill is going to go up, whether your product's going to be needed in the next 10 or 15, the next 5 years or so. Because that's a risk. Excellent question. Any other questions? In the remaining 5 minutes or so. Hopefully this has been helpful. It's been a lot to download. And I've given you a set of questions to kind of help you work through that. What I'll do with Jaya's permission is have maybe 5 minutes or 10 minutes at the beginning of the next session, just for you to come back with all the questions that have bubbled through your mind in that period when you've had a chance to digest it all and to ask that series of questions.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I think everyone has got so many things in there, once they go back and can look at their real situations, maybe more questions will come.
Yeah, it's a lot to
next
download in one time. So I'm happy to have a session at the beginning of that. Bring your questions.
Yep.
And we'll talk about those at that point when everybody's had a chance to digest it all and to think through the long list of questions I gave you.
Yeah, before we start the second topic, isn't it?
Before we start the second topic.
Yeah. Okay.
And then you might pay more attention to the second topic because you realize that it's important.
Yeah.
And you have to get it right.
Meanwhile, if any one of you have got any suggestions or anything that you wanted Chris to explain in the next one, please feel free to email me so that I can pass it on to Chris.
If I missed anything or
anything, just let me know and email me and I can pass it on to Chris before next week so that we get more information from him. Let's make use of him to the maximum. Okay. Thank you so much, Chris.
Thanks for coming,
thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, and see you. Oh, okay. Bye-bye.